By morning the frost had turned to a thin lace along the fence wire, and the sun came up weak and white as though it, too, were unsure of the day. The boy ate his porridge without fuss, quiet as any child, yet every now and then his mouth shaped a word in that strange, careful way, like a carpenter setting a nail. His mother kept glancing at his bowl to see if steam still rose. His father stirred the ashes and fed the iron stove with hush and habit. No one spoke of the night. The house seemed to hold its breath for them. Word does not travel so much as it walks. It went from the well to the post road and then to the store, and by noon the yard was full of boots. Neighbors came all respectful, hats in hand, asking after the child's health, yet their eyes slipped past the parents to the boy himself, as if he were a lamp just lit. Mrs. Alder, who had buried 3 children and believed she could smell sickness like rain, pressed the back of her hand to his cheek. "Cool as creek stone," she said, with a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. They moved to the barn, for the air was warmer there with animals breathing and the sweet reek of hay. Dust motes sifted down from the rafters like small stars. The boy sat upon an upturned crate, a quilt around his shoulders. A dozen souls gathered in a half-circle, men with hands cracked by cold, women with aprons folded neat, a pair of boys too young to be solemn and yet trying. Someone had sent for Caldwell's cousin, a clerk who did figures for the railroad and had once read in Latin at school. He came with his coat misbuttoned, spectacles fogged, a little hungry for wonder in a life of ledgers. The father, to his friends, cleared his throat. The sound bounced off timber and fell to the straw. "Son," he said gently, and the boy looked up at him with that new listening in his eyes. "Say what you said in the night." The boy's lips moved. What came out was steady and strange, a string of syllables that marched like soldiers with polished boots. It was not song, and it was not babble. The clerk cocked his head, counting quietly on his fingers, then let out a breath he had been holding. "Dominus," he whispered. "He's saying the Lord's Prayer." In Latin. A murmur went around like wind through corn, soft, fearful, odd. Mrs. Alder crossed herself, though it was not her custom. One of the boys chuckled, until his mother's hand found the back of his neck and stilled him. "Ask him something," Jed said. "Ask what your books would ask." The clerk swallowed. "Poor," he began, unsure how to speak to a child in a tongue older than their town. "Quid est nomen tuum?" The room held tight to the quiet. The boy answered at once, and the clerk's eyes shone behind the misted glass. "He says his name," the clerk breathed, "and he says it like a scholar would, as if each letter were a step." The door opened and Cold came in with a man in a black coat smelling of wet wool and travel. He was a priest, collar white as bone. His horse stood steaming in the yard. "I am Father Malloy," he said, touching his hat. "I was told a child here speaks as angels do." He looked not at the parents but at the boy, and then glanced up into the barn rafters as though expecting something to be perched there, unseen. Later, the mother would remember that glance and feel a small thread pull in her stomach, though she could not have said why. "Father," Jed said, keeping his voice even, "we'd be obliged if you'd hear him and tell us straight." The priest nodded and knelt so he could look the boy in the face. He spoke first in Latin, clean and quick, then in the soft French you sometimes heard in these parts from old trappers, then in a sharper tongue none could name. Each time, the boy answered with the same measured calm, as if drawing water from a deep well and finding it sweet. The priest's jaw worked. He made the sign across his chest, not slow, but hurried, as if to catch up with something running ahead. "Some gifts," he said at last, "are sent to test us." His eyes went to the mother. "Guard him from crowds. The curious can be cruel." His caution came late. Already the yard held more boots than it should. They tried to return to work, but the farm had shifted on its axis. Hens clucked and tore at the straw with a new violence, and the sow refused her mash until the boy had gone by. The wind slackened. Even the creak of the pump handle seemed changed. The mother, Martha, set dough to rise and found her hands trembling. A small fear ran up her arm with the flour dust, swift as a spider. She watched her son wrap twine around his fingers, a childish game, and tie knots with a neatness he had never shown. It was the neatness that stung her. Wonder can carry a sliver of dread inside it, She could feel the sliver now. By afternoon, other tongues arrived, not from the boy but the people. A German mason from the next township pushed forward, cap in hand. He spoke to the child in curling syllables thick as bread. The boy listened, eyes bright as though a hidden violin had begun to sing, and answered him back in that same curving speech. The mason's mouth opened. Tears came to his raw, mortar-bitten cheeks. Spricht wie mein Vater, he said to the room. He speaks like my father. He could not stop himself. He sank to his knees in straw and took the boy's quilted hand and pressed it as if it were a relic from some old church in a country he had left but never left. Then a woman stepped forward, shawl tight, her hair braided with pins. Her family had come from lands farther than most could point to on a map. She sang a line, scarcely above a whisper, and the boy completed it in a tongue filled with stones and water. The woman's oar rose like a hush at the end of a hymn. You could feel it ripple through the barn, small as a shiver, large as a tide. Doubt, thin but real, cut through the awe. From the back, a man who measured all things in coin said, "He's been taught. Some circus trick." He spit and missed the knot of straw he aimed at. "You'll see, someone stands to gain." His words fell heavy. The mother felt heat in her face, shame and anger braided together. The priest turned his head a fraction, as if hearing a bell a long way off, and did not answer. When they broke for supper, no one left. The sky lowered, pewter and tired. Lamps were lit. The smell of oil rose, that sharp breath that suggests both comfort and danger. Flames laid thin hands upon the beams. The boy sat between his parents at the small table in the kitchen, and Martha put stew in his bowl. He thanked her in English, plain as you please. Relief spread warm in her chest, foolish and dear, like finding a keepsake you feared lost. For a moment the day felt ordinary. Then the boy turned to his father and asked, in a dry-clipped speech the clerk called Greek, whether he might have more salt. The relief was gone as quick as a pulled thread, leaving a small hole in its place. Night pressed itself to the window glass. Outside, the cottonwoods bobbed their black heads. They moved back to the barn only because the house seemed too small to hold whatever had come into the world with the boy's voice. Dogs barked and were hushed. Lamps made islands of light upon straw. Father Malloy announced he would test the child with scripture and with verse, for the devil, he said, could be clever with sounds but careless with meaning. The clerk stood ready with notebook and pencil, though his fingers had gone numb in the cold and in the nearness of a thing he could not tally. It began to feel like a service, though no bell had been rung. The priest asked for the creed in Latin, and the boy gave it whole, the phrases fitting into one another like joints cut true. The clerk tried him with a line of Virgil, and the boy, head slightly cocked, supplied the next line and then the next. The mason asked him, shyly, for a common prayer, and the boy gave him a child's bedtime rhyme in German, the kind mother's whisper when the night has teeth. Each answer pressed the people tighter together. Warm breath showed in the cold air. A mare stamped and quieted, as if listening. Jed stood to the side, hands folded, farmer's hands that had always known what to fix and how. He looked at his son and did not know where to put his eyes. Pride warred with something older, a feeling a man gets when he hears the river under ice, invisible but strong. He remembered how last winter the ice broke without warning, and a boy from up the road went through and came up 3 days later under a bend half a mile away. He thought of that now and did not know why. When the testing paused, the crowd loosened, whisper turning to talk. A stick cracked in the stove and flared, pitch popped. Lamps hissed gently as oil climbed the wick. The boy yawned and leaned his head to his mother's side, the weight of him simple and beloved. Martha stroked his hair and watched the priest's lips move in silent prayer. She felt awe settle gently on her like a shawl. She did not shrug it off. All warms even as it pinches. Then the sound came, the rattle of wheels on frozen ruts, iron ring against stone. Heads turned. The dog gave a single low bark. The priest's prayer stopped. Jed's mouth made a hard line. Outside, in the yard, lantern light swung, and on it rocked a carriage whose windows held the dull glow of the lamps within. On the door was painted a small seal none in the barn could read, and from inside came the careful voices of city men unused to mud. The wheels ceased their rattle. A gloved hand knocked on the frame of the barn, firm and polite, as if already invited. The gloved hand knocked again, a courtly rap that belonged to town, not field. Jed slid the door and let the cold make itself known. Two men stepped in with the night still shining on their shoulders. Coats dark as wet slate, collars starched, neat beards. Behind them, the carriage lantern wavered, and breath from the team steamed like soup on a winter table. "We come from St. Louis," the taller said, touching the brim of his hat as if he were in a hallway and not in straw. "Dr. Aldrich. This is Dr. Pierce." Their eyes found the boy at once, the way needles find cloth. Father Malloy stood, smoothing his coat. "You will speak gently," he said, without edge. "He is a child." The doctors gave the kind of smile meant for mothers and priests alike, and set down a leather case that creaked like an old book. The smell of lamp oil pressed close. The barn listened. Martha drew the quilt tighter about her son's shoulders. The boy watched the case as if it might also speak. Dr. Aldrich took out a brass instrument and warmed it with his palm before laying it to the boy's chest. "Breathe," he murmured. The boy breathed. The brass kissed skin, then the doctor's head bent. "Strong," he said. He tapped the boy's knee with 2 fingers. "Steady." He peered into the boy's eyes with a tiny glass. "Clear." The barn's timbers ticked with an old winter sound. Dr. Pierce opened a notebook. "We are told he speaks the classics," he said, "and other varieties." He glanced at Father Malloy, then at the clerk, then at the ring of faces. "You will hear us ask unkind questions. Do not mistake that for unkind hearts." Jed gave one short nod. Words were cheaper than corn and sometimes not worth the husk. He laced his fingers and waited. The questions began simple. The doctors set a coal scuttle near for warmth, shifted the lamp, and had the boy name objects. Spoon, lamp, rope. Then name them again, but in Latin, in French, in the German that made the mason's chin tremble as if he had found his father's chair unchanged after years. The boy's mouth shaped each sound with the care of a craftsman sanding an edge. Dr. Aldrich's pencil scratched like a mouse in the walls. They tried him with lines from Scripture. Father Malloy gave Latin, and the boy answered with the precision of a school reader. The clerk, hungry for his own bookish proof, offered a scrap of Virgil. The boy found the rest. The barn took a small breath together, awe passing across it like a ripple that leaves no mark and yet makes the shore remember. Dr. Pierce folded his hands. "Child," he said in a careful Greek that tasted of schoolrooms, "what do men seek?" The boy tilted his head a fraction, as if listening to someone in the rafters. "They seek to be remembered," he said in that same dry music. The doctor's mouth twitched. He did not write it down. "Perhaps he has learned by ear," a voice from near the door offered. The man of coin had edged closer, encouraged by city coats. "Parlor tricks travel with wagons." He stopped when Dr. Aldrich's look found him. "We keep the parlor in town," the doctor said mildly. "This is a barn." They asked the boy to repeat nonsense, to test for echo. They jumbled words. They spoke in a dialect of French that fishermen, those who mended nets on the river, might use over coffee before dawn. The boy answered, not only with the sense but with a fisherman's shrug caught in his voice. The traveling priest turned to the beam and touched it, as if it could steady him. Martha watched the boy's hands as much as his mouth. The fingers moved while he spoke, counting without pride, tying and untying the same small loop of twine as if speech rose first from the hands and then leapt to the tongue. She had a mother's ear for strain. She heard none. Still, the thread pulled at her. When the boy paused, she brought him water. His thanks came soft and in English, and that warmed her more than the stove.
Dr. Pierce raised a palm. "Forgive me, Father," he said, "but if this be heaven's mark, it will not bruise under our touching." He drew out a small amber bottle. Not for the child, for his father. He held it up. "Smell. Laudanum. That bitter. Now ask the boy how it is called." Jed sniffed, blinked, set the bottle down. The boy named it in 3 tongues, none of them English. One was Hebrew. Father Malloy whispered, "Something old as the first rain." "Have you taught him?" Dr. Aldrich asked, eyes on Jed. It was not an accusation. It was a path, and they were obliged to walk it. "I have taught him to cull beans and chop wood." Jed said. I do not own what you speak. His hands remained laced, but a ridge showed along his jaw. The doctors exchanged a look that was not disbelief, not faith, but the tidy place between where men like them sleep. Dr. Pierce bent to the boy again. Tell me what I say, he said in a language no one in the barn could name. It fell like pebbles into water, hard sounds softened by time. The boy repeated it, then answered it, and the answer made the hair rise a fraction along the doctor's wrists. What was that? The clerk asked, pencil lifted. Dr. Pierce shook his head once. Not Greek, not Latin, not the tongues given to school. He did not say he had a professor once who had written such syllables with chalk and called them older than their churches. He did not say it, because the word older felt like a draft at his feet. There will be order, Father Malloy said gently. He is no fairground. He is a soul. Dr. Aldrich agreed at once, quick to claim gentleness. We propose a proper sitting tomorrow, he said, in the church for calm and witness and record. His eyes moved over the gathered faces, the barn, the frost crawling like lace along the inside of the boards. It will be quiet and short. Behind him, the mason closed his eyes, and the woman with the braided hair pressed a fist to her mouth. Quiet, in a town hungry for wonder, is a shy bird. Martha looked at the priest. The priest looked at Jed. Jed looked at the boy. If Father says so, Jed answered. He tried to believe his words were the fence that would hold the field. They broke the circle. Neighbors went to their homes to draw water and spread word without meaning to. The doctors took rooms at the inn and left behind the rustle of paper and a faint smell of camphor. Father Malloy stayed. He insisted on prayer, not in Latin, but in the plain tongue of the kitchen, and Martha's shoulders eased, though she could not have said why. The boy fell asleep in her lap as her lips moved. Lamplight leaned and shortened and leaned again. The stove sighed. The world returned, piece by simple piece. When the boy woke, it was to the small sounds of a house at rest, the mouse in the wall, the wind nudging the pump handle, the dog's paws working through a dream. He reached toward the lamp, the wick turned low, and gave its shadow a name in a language that tasted like iron and river stones. Martha smoothed his hair. Hush, she said, and he hushed. Near dawn, a robin practiced a foolish song in the cottonwood, though the cold told it no. Jed stepped to the door, lifted the latch, and let the morning's pail in. He went to the yard and touched the wheel rut frozen hard as pewter, then stood listening. In the barn, the rope creaked once on its beam, a small, ordinary sound. And yet he kept listening. The church bell did not ring at that hour. The bell rope lay slack as a whipped mule. Still, when the sun climbed, thin and stubborn as a child learning his letters, it found a line of people already strung from gate to road, shawls pulled up, hats in hands, breath making little clouds. The farm had grown a pulse overnight. A paper nailed to the post announced the hour, the boy to be heard, and gentlemen from the city to see him proper. Martha set the boy's hair with her wet palm and rapped him. He looked up at her with that new listening, as if she were speaking without words. Father Malloy smoothed his stole. The clerk tucked his pencil behind his ear, as proud as a rooster at daybreak. The yard held its hush. Jed put his hand on the latch of the barn again, then paused because from the road came a second carriage, this one white with frost and marked with a painted cross, and seated within was not a doctor nor a priest, but a woman with a leather satchel, and an expression that looked like the sky before a storm. And as she stepped down, the boy turned his face toward her and spoke a greeting in a tongue none of them had yet heard. They took the boy to the church as the pale sun climbed, boots shuffling, shawls pulled tight, breath a low smoke. The whitewashed boards held the night's cold. The pews gave back the smells of beeswax and damp coats. Father Malloy set the lamp high, so the light washed the altar rail. Dust rose and hung like small, patient stars. The bell rope lay along the nave, thick and worn where many hands had pulled it for weddings and for storms. Much later they would remember how its braid showed a small pale fray near the knot, like something waiting. The woman from the frost-bit carriage came forward without fuss. She had no veil, no habit. The cross on her door, now only a memory in mud. A plain will dress the brown of riverbanks, a dark shawl, a leather satchel that had seen miles. "Eliza Whitcomb," she said in a voice that held classrooms and sick rooms together. "American Bible Society. I carry alphabets more often than medicine." She looked at the boy with a steadiness that was not unkind. "May I sit with him a while?" Jed nodded. Martha touched the quilt at the boy's knees and stepped back, though not far. The doctors occupied the first pew like officers at drill, notebooks ready, pencils blunted to kind points. The clerk stood with his pencil behind his ear, hungry for order. The mason, hat twisting, took a side aisle. The woman with braided hair folded her hands as if over old bread. Father Malloy lifted both arms. "We will keep quiet. We will keep clean hearts. We will ask only what we must." The church answered with quiet of the good kind. Miss Whitcomb opened her satchel and drew out little boards painted with letters, the paint dark as dried berries. She set them on the altar rail, one by one. Latin script first, then Greek, then other marks that seemed like twigs bound with wind. The boy watched, head slightly tilted, eyes not dreamy, but keen. "Child," she said softly, "what is this?" She tapped an A. "Apple," he said. She touched alpha. He gave the name, gently. She laid out a square of right-to-left letters, close and ancient, and he read them as if he had always known they walked the other way. Dr. Aldrich's pencil scratched. Dr. Pierce did not write. He watched the boy's mouth as if it were about to shape a weather change. Miss Whitcomb took a small pause, then reached deeper into the satchel. "These," she said, "are from a people few of us have met, a book rescued from a mission 3 rivers journey from here." She placed a rough page upon the rail, ink faded to the worn color of winter grass. She did not say its name. The boy leaned, fingers on wood, and murmured a line in a music none had yet heard, all earth and flint. The sound lay on the pews like a new snowfall that asks for silence. The woman with braided hair drew in a small breath and pressed it flat beneath her palm. Father Malloy spoke a psalm in Latin to set the church in its place, then stepped aside. Dr. Pierce tried the trick he loved, ask in one language, receive in another. "Who made the world?" he asked in French, soft as cloth. The boy answered in the Riverstone speech. "Who made the world?" the doctor asked in Greek. The boy answered in the upright tongue of the boards with twig-like letters. "Who made the world?" the doctor asked in English. The boy closed his eyes for a heartbeat and answered in a whisper that seemed older than any painted mark. The first pew shifted, wood creaked, all moved quietly and found a seat. Miss Whitcomb's face did not change. "Child," she said, "would you read for us?" She slid forward a thin tract, no bigger than her hand, full of tidy, careful words. The boy bent, and instead of reading those neat lines, he traced his finger just above the paper, following ink that was not there. His voice gathered a measure and began to tell of a house by a river with 7 doors and a woman who kept a garden of bitter herbs. The sense came clear even to those who knew none of the words, a story carried in tone and in the rise and fall that belongs to anybody who has ever sat by a hearth and listened. The people did not move. The stove did a little tick. Snow light pressed itself against the narrow windows. Martha held her apron, twisting the seam. Warmth had risen in her chest, and for a moment she let it be, as simple as a mother pleased to hear her child speak without stumbling. Then a small doubt cut through her warmth and left a thin, cool line. The doctors conferred in whispers. The clerk kept his eyes on Miss Whitcomb's hands. She put away the tracts, then reached once more into the satchel and drew out a square of linen, folded with care, bound with blue thread. She untied it. Inside lay a brittle slip of paper rubbed half to ghost the fragment of a letter. "I found this years ago in a church box in Cairo, Illinois," she said. "Not the old Cairo of pharaohs, only the bend where 2 rivers meet. The man who wrote it had traveled. He copied a prayer he heard in a yard where no church stood. I have not yet found the tongue." She offered it to the boy. He did not touch it. He listened to it, his head a fraction to one side, as if a fly had gone past. Then he spoke, low, round, steady, and the prayer settled on the room like a shawl, smelling of smoke and lake wind. Miss Whitcomb's mouth softened at the corners, a grief easing a little as a splinter slides, free, beneath a needle. She bowed her head when it finished. "Thank you," she said, and it was not the thank you one gives to a child. Father Malloy set his hand upon the boy's crown. "Enough," he said. "He is tired." The boy opened his eyes, not tired at all. Miss Whitcomb was already closing the satchel. Dr. Aldrich rose, a gentleman returning from wonder to ledger. "One more," he said. He meant kindness, and he meant record. He reached for the lamp, lifted the chimney, and turned the wick up until the flame climbed too high, and the glass soot in an instant. "What is this called," he asked, "when fire takes the air and leaves stain?" The boy named it in something that sounded like a smith's chant, and added, in the same breath, the old word for smoke that stays even after washing. The church's bare rafters caught the sound and kept it for a moment. There was a stirring in the last pew, the restless shiver of boys too long good. The man of coin lurked there, muttering. "Trickery," he said, not loud, but not soft. "Some show." He might have said more, yet the dog that had slipped under the pews earlier put its head down and went still, not the still of sleep, but the still of listening. The whole church joined the dog without knowing it. The bell rope did not move. The altar cloth had no wind to bother it. Still the air shifted, the faintest sense of a door opening where no door had been. "Child," Miss Whitcomb said very softly, "can you tell us who teaches you?" The boy turned his face toward her and opened his mouth. Nothing came for a breath. Then he said a name none of them knew, and yet some turned their heads toward the west windows, as if they expected a figure to cross from the river and take the front pew left of the aisle. Father Malloy's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder and then eased, as one calms a horse that flinches at shadow. Jed stood just behind his son, hands at his sides, farmer's hands, scar black with old stove soot. He looked past the boy to the lamp glass, to the soot finger that now marked an arc like a small eclipse. He had the odd thought that at evening he would have to wash that out with vinegar, that the stain would not give easy. He did not know why the thought stung. Miss Whitcomb raised her eyes to the rafters, as if the proper word might be perched there. "We thank you," she said, and this time she spoke to more than the boy. "We will rest now." She began to gather the boards. People stood in the slow, careful way of folks who have lost and found something without a name. Then from a tower above them, where the bell rested its iron lip upon the timber, there came a single toll, one clear, measured note without hand on the rope. And as it lingered in the rafters, the boy smiled and turned his head toward the church door, as if someone had just stepped inside. The single toll faded and left the church listening to itself. The boy's eyes were on the door. It stood shut, yet a colder thread of air walked in among the warmed coats and met the lamp's breath. Father Malloy's hand remained on the child's shoulder. "If anyone has business with God," he said, "steady as fence post, he may stay to plain." The latch did not lift, but somewhere above, a fleck of old mortar fell from a tower, a soft tick upon the flagstones. Miss Whitcomb raised her head. "Let us begin again," she said, as if the bell had been a page turning and not a hand. People settled back to their pews, with groaning in little human ways. The doctors signaled order. The clerk squared his paper as though squares could save him. Jed moved half a pace, so his shadow joined the boys on the whitewashed wall. Martha smoothed the quilt across her son's knees and drew back her hand, not yet willing to let it go far. The stove gave a small pop. Lamp oil sharpened the air, sweet and dangerous. Dr. Aldrich stepped to the aisle. "For record," he announced, though he spoke more to the idea of record than to any ear, "we will proceed from the known to the un." His words halted because the boy was already speaking. He spoke toward the door, soft as if to a friend who prefers small talk to long sermons. The syllables were neither Latin nor French, nor the creek bed German of the mason. They rang like iron laid on an anvil and cooled in water. Miss Whitcomb's gloved fingers tightened on the boards she had not yet put away. "Who is there?" Father Malloy asked, not in Latin now, not in priest voice, but in the simple one he used at sickbeds. The boy's answer carried the name he had offered before, that river-round name none knew. At the sound, the old dog under the last pew rolled to face the door and thumped its tail once, as if greeting a figure every other creature had missed. Martha leaned. The quilt edge brushed the boy's wrist. "To whom do you speak, my lamb?" she asked, but the boy had turned his head, listening elsewhere, not to pews, not to rafters, perhaps to that thin thread of colder air that parceled itself between all the breaths in the room and stood apart. Miss Whitcomb stepped forward, voice dressed in calm. "Child, we will read together," she said. "You and I will set the pace." She placed a narrow book upon the kneeler, its spine mended with linen, its letters prim. The boy looked down and smiled, not at the English lines, but at the shadow the page cast upon the polished wood. He put his finger upon the shadow's edge and began to say words that had never met ink. They mounted one upon the next like stones in a causeway across a winter marsh. The people found they could feel the path without walking it. The clerk's pencil flew and ran and could not keep up. Dr. Pierce, who enjoyed a trick until the trick proved larger than his hand, tried to interrupt. "He strings sounds," he protested, thin with heat. But even as he spoke, the boy turned the same voice upon Pierce and said 2 lines in the clipped university Greek the doctor had learned as a young man, then another in Greek of the fisherman, then another that bore no school at all. Pierce's protest folded itself like a letter no longer required and found his pocket without him asking. Father Malloy breathed once, deep and even, and lifted his palm. The boy paused. "There is a danger," the priest said gently, which could have meant the crowd, the child's strength, the heat of the lamps, or the thing that had come to the door without coming. He nodded toward the rope that lay along the nave, its braid pale where the tug of years had thinned it. "We are not here to ring the bell for sport." The rope made the smallest sound, a lazy twist against the boards, as if it had heard its name. The doctors asked then for the display they'd rumored to men on porches and boys with errands. "One after another," Aldrich said, his voice now careful the way men grow careful near a skittish horse. "The Lord's Prayer, the Creed, the 10 Commandments, as many tongues as he owns." Father Malloy hesitated. Miss Whitcomb did not. "Short," she ordered. "Short and clean." She looked at the child, and in that look was a promise made to mothers she had known in towns with other names. The boy drew a breath and began. The Latin came first, as the clerk expected, crisp as apples when the frost has just kissed the skin. Then French, smooth and river-worn. Then the German that made the mason bow his head. He spoke Greek, both of the school and of the docks. He spoke a soft tongue that ran like summer milk. The woman with the braided hair lifted her face, tears standing. He spoke the prickly speech of the board with twig-like letters, and one of the doctors whispered the name of it and then bit his lip, as if the word were too old to carry out in public. He spoke the hard riverstone music he had used for the door, and then a chant that sounded like nails driven true. The count slid along on the clerk's pencil. 8, 9, 10, 11, still the boy's voice held a steady tide, never hurried, never proud. At 12 the air in the church felt crowded. At 13 the lamp chimney showed a spider-fine line, a hair of glass where heat had pressed too long. At 14 the boy's voice thinned. He lifted his chin and let the last prayer fall in a tongue, so simple it felt like the first word a child says to the night. Then he stopped. The dog put its head upon its paws. No one moved. Martha's fear broke open inside her like cold water thrown from a pail. It ran through her limbs, and she had to grip the pew to keep from going to her knees. The boy had not swooned as stories make wonder-workers swoon. He had grown still in a way that left no room for anything else. His eyelids fluttered once, as if something bright had passed behind them, and then his head slumped forward, cheek finding the quilt's edge. His breath came, then waited, then came again, a little late, like someone missing a stair in the dark. Miss Whitcomb reached him first. She put 2 fingers to the hollow at his throat and then to his wrist. "He is spent," she said, and the word felt like a wool shawl thrown over fire. Father Malloy touched the boy's hair and murmured a prayer without book or Latin, only the small words a man uses when he sits by a bed. Dr. Aldrich turned the wick down to save the glass from cracking. The line in it dulled but did not vanish. The clerk, whose pencil had no more tricks, set it quietly upon the rail, as if it had become a relic. "Fresh air," Pierce ordered, glad for a thing he could command. The door bar lifted. The pale day stood there, thin and patient. People parted to let it in. Jed slid his hands under his boy and lifted him from the stool. The weight surprised him. How light it was, as if a sack half its grain had been poured out. He held fast anyway. Martha gathered the quilt and tucked it to the small shoulder, the way she had done when storms knocked at the roof in the spring. Outside, the crowd, already strung from gate to road, drew tight as if a single thread had been pulled. Some crossed themselves. Some craned to see if the child's lips moved still. The man of coins said there now, with the satisfaction of men who prefer outcomes that fit their pocket. The old woman who smelled of nettle tea spat once, and said a country charm as quiet as mice. Miss Whitcomb walked at Martha's side, the satchel on her arm and a look upon her face like weather coming. At the threshold the bell rope brushed Jed's coat. He glanced at it. The pale fray near the knot had lengthened by one single hair. He carried the boy over it as if a stream ran there. They went into the daylight. The snow at the eaves had begun to weep. Every sound had a wet edge. Wagon rims fussed at the ruts. A crow let out a clean cough and left the steeple, its black wings cutting the cold like shears. "Home," Martha said, and the words steadied the world a little. Father Malloy nodded. "Home," he agreed. And quiet. The doctors did not argue. Their hats had found a lower tilt. The clerk slipped his pencil behind his ear, then reached up and touched it as if to make sure it would not fly away. Miss Whitcomb looked not at the road, but at the river path that curved between the cottonwoods, as if an appointment waited there. They had gone a dozen steps when the boy stirred. His lips parted. A single syllable gathered with difficulty, like a bubble climbing cold honey. It rose and broke, a word in no one's tongue, or perhaps in all of them at once, a sound like farewell, if farewell had been taught to the wind. Jed stopped. Martha felt the world lean, and from behind them, inside the church they had just left, the bell gave a second, lower note, as if something had set it with a careful hand and meant to be heard before night came. They carried him home and laid him in the loft bed where frost traced ferns on the window, and the roof beams held the slow, ticking chill. The stove below kept a small red eye. Martha warmed lamp oil between her fingers and turned the wick just so. A thin, sweet scent rose and settled in the boards. The boy slept with his mouth parted, breath keeping time with the wind. Jed sat on the trunk and cleaned his boots because work kept the world square. Now and then the floor gave a soft complaint, an old house telling its age. By noon the first knock came, flat and polite. Dr. Aldrich's hat brim showed at the glass. Pierce stood behind him with his pencil ready like a match that wished for strike. They asked to take the boy to St. Louis for a week, observation, safe boarding, a stipend. Jed said the roads were poor. Martha said the child had winter in his bones. Father Malloy, who had come to sit by the stove and keep a hand on silence, said the will of the family would stand. The doctors bowed to words the way travelers bow to weather, and left papers that looked like promises until you read them twice. Through the afternoon the town stopped by in pairs, with pies wrapped in towels and questions wrapped in nicety. The mason left a little carven cross he had cut from a stall rail. The woman with the braided hair brought nettle tea and said long miles could be walked in a day if the road were straight. The man of coin stayed longest and said the world had a habit of setting its price. He felt helpful saying it. Miss Whitcomb arrived last, her satchel lighter, her eyes holding a fixed thought. She touched the boy's cool hand and spoke no test. Near dusk the child woke and asked for water in plain English. Martha held the cup and watched him drink. "Thank you," he said, and the thank you landed like bread in an empty stomach. Jed made a sound deep in his chest, not speech, not prayer. The lamp hummed softly. The room felt mended. Then the child turned his head and tried to name the cup again, and the name would not come. He frowned, not in hurt, but as if a lark that had lived in his throat had flown without warning. He tried another word in another voice and found only air. Miss Whitcomb drew the quilt higher. "Rest," she said. "Let the mouth be quiet." Father Malloy lifted the Bible and read a line in the plain tongue, low and slow, not for show, but to lay a simple track back into the day. The boy listened. His eyes did not shine with strange light. They looked like any boy's eyes in winter, wary of the cold. A single doubt pricked Martha, quick and small. If the gift had never belonged to him at all. After supper the wind found a seam and spoke through it. The cottonwoods bowed and made the old creek bridge knock like a spoon on a pot. Jed went out to bank the barn door and saw the bell rope through the open church porch, its braid showing a pale new nick near the knot, thin as a hair. One spring storm, he thought, and it would give. He shut the barn firm and came back with straw on his sleeves. Night took the yard. The stove snapped once, and then only held. The boy slept and woke and slept again. When he woke, words came as if they had sunk below easy reach. He would shape the first and lose the second. He would reach for the third and remember milk instead, or the smell of axle grease in the wagon hub. Miss Whitcomb tried a letterboard, and he shook his head and smiled, ashamed without knowing why. Father Malloy folded the board away. "Enough," he said, and his voice made a safe corner in the room. Close to midnight, the quiet drew a little tighter around them. Jed kept watch at the window, a farmer's eyes seeing only what lantern light allows. Martha worked the boy's stiff fingers, one by one, like winter wheat heads she used to rub in the palm to guess the harvest. The floorboards gave a dry lick under the bed. Somewhere a mouse dared the bread box. The dog by the stove dreamed and clenched its paws. When the child spoke again, it was in a soft mutter that meant nothing and everything, a river's edge of sound. He turned his face toward the wall, then toward the door, then toward the small square of frost where a star had drawn its silent thorn. Toward dawn the house loosened. A color like watered milk slid into the rafters. Jed brewed coffee mean and strong. The boy sat up and blinked as if he had gone a long way and had come back without souvenirs. "I dreamed the gate," he said. "I came to it, and it was kinder than the word for it." Martha kissed his brow and felt only skin. Miss Whitcomb wrote nothing down. Father Malloy bowed his head without closing his eyes. Before the sun climbed, wheels sounded on the road. Not many, but sure. The city men returned with a wagon that looked like medicine and law together. They had new papers and a man from the county with a seal. They spoke of duty and opportunity and shelves that held jars for rare things so they would not break. Jed stood with his hands in his pockets and listened until his shoulders went still. Martha tied her apron twice. Miss Whitcomb stepped between the men and the loft ladder without seeming to move her feet. "You may speak to the air," she said, "but the child is not the air. It might have gone to shouting. It did not." The boy coughed, and the cough had dust in it, and all but Martha and Jed stepped back as if a different power had entered the room, and it came on boots, not wind. The county man folded his paper. "We will come again," he said. "We will bring patience next time, and perhaps the law." Their wagon rumbled off, slow to show its back. The day held. Jed mended a gate whose hinge had worked loose. He liked a nail better than a prayer. Martha boiled an egg and made the child take half. Father Malloy mended his cuff with black thread. Miss Whitcomb sent the clerk to fetch 2 books she had left in town and did not say why she needed them. When he returned, she did not open them. She sat and told the boy a small story about a river ferry and a man who charged a penny for silence, and the child laughed once the way he had laughed before any of this had begun. By evening the wind forgot itself. Frost came again and drew a fern on the same window pane. The boy felt light enough to stand. He walked from the bed to the lamp and put 2 fingers to the warm glass and did not burn, then to the quilt and felt only wool. He tried a prayer he had owned the day before and found only its shape. His eyes filled. He hit it quick, and Martha pretended not to see, and then saw it anyway. They took turns sleeping in chairs. The hour when farms lie between beats came and went. Sometime in that soft middle, the child woke and sat, not slow, but all at once, as if someone had touched his shoulder. He swung his legs to the floor. The boards answered. Jed looked up. "What do you need, boy?" he asked. "Water?" The boy shook his head. He walked to the window and laid his palm on the frost fern until the mark of his hand showed like a white flower. He spoke in English, quiet and careful. "He is at the ford," he said. "He says the water is low." The room did not change, and yet everything leaned. Father Malloy set his feet, since a man should be standing when a call comes. Miss Whitcomb went to the peg and took down her shawl and put it around Martha's shoulders, because hands know before minds do. Jed lifted the latch. Cold slid in and stood on the threshold with them like a fifth person. The yard was a print of old silver. The church roof held its quiet. The rope in the porch hung still. The cottonwoods kept their arms tight and spare. Down the path, where the creek made its slow turn past the ferry stump, a thin smoke rose, low and straight, the kind a man makes when he means to be seen. And as they watched, the smoke drew a line in the air that pointed to the bend, and the boy smiled as if the lesson were at last simple.